Good morning, everybody. It's a special extra early morning version of Charter Moms Chats. I'm Inga Cotton. I'm the founder and executive director of San Antonio Charter Moms. And Charter Moms Chats are an opportunity to have conversations to help parents learn how to exercise their school options in San Antonio. And today on the blog, we have a new guest post and what we call Teacher Tales. And I've connected with Paul Phillips, who's a math interventionist at Great Hearts Live Oak. And so I encourage everybody to click on the link in the description of the video so you can read Paul's guest post. He talks about his journey to becoming a teacher and how he has found Great Hearts Live Oak and what he appreciates about the culture there and the opportunity to teach there. But I'm really happy that we get to have a conversation with Paul to hear in his own words and have a dialogue. And we can bring comments on screen. So if you're watching the video and you have a question for Paul, just type it in the comments. I'll see if I can work it into the conversation. So Paul, thank you for joining me during your brief free time during your busy school day.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. So I wanted to. Okay. So one of the things that I really appreciated about your post was that you offer very specific advice. So for families who are visiting a school, kind of what should they be looking at as far as how the students are behaving or how the students are interacting in that setting.
Well, it's one thing I've noticed in my time in different schools is that, parents have a interesting, maybe not exactly perfectly clear understanding of what goes on in the school, mostly because they are usually only talking to the school's administration, which their job is to kind of talk to parents. If you really want to get a good understanding of what is happening in the school, generally speaking, you should be looking at the students in the school, not necessarily the administration, or even strictly speaking, the teachers. So if the students seem like they are orderly and well kept, and things it doesn't look like complete chaos, that usually means that the school has a pretty good ability to direct the students in a productive manner, rather than just kind of, babysitting, which I feel like a lot of schools are nowadays.
Right. So, I just want to share a shout out from Bridie Shoutout, who's watching. She says, looking forward to the Charter Moms Chat, and she thanks you for representing Great Hearts. So, and then she adds, yes, you can tell so much from student behavior. That was something I really appreciate. Yeah, about your post is that, it's not always, I guess, words are words, and a school leader can, describe the mission of the school, or they can say, some flowery things about what happens in the school. But as you described, if you are able to visit the school and observe and look at the students' behavior, not even more so than the teachers, but how is this filtering down to the students? Is it orderly? Is it an environment where students are learning? That's something that parents should be looking out for when they're exercising school choice.
Certainly. That's not really 100% certain what the question was.
Can
you state that again? Sorry.
No, I'm just echoing back. So I wanted to ask you, okay, so your post is really helpful because you talk about what your experiences at Great Hearts Live Oak, but I know you didn't start out as in education in your career. So can you talk more about kind of your journey, towards education as a career?
Right. Well, my first, I guess you could call it career, was a soldier in the Army. I joined, I joined a month and a half before 9/11. So I was in basic training when the two towers went down. So that was a bit of an eye-opening experience for me. And then I spent the next 6.5 years around the world. It taught me a lot. And when I got out of the service, I had a different concept for where my life was going to go, which is why I got my education in the fields that it did. But as so often happens in life, it didn't really work out. And then when I realized that, I was like, okay, well, what can I do? I can yell at people. As a sergeant in the Army, as a pretty big skill I had. And then I remember a distant relative, I think he was an uncle or something, saying that he'd been working in the public school system for 20 years, and he said it's a pretty rewarding experience. And I decided to take him up on that. And I realized that I'd always had a pretty good talent for motivating people. And I always liked school. So it just kind of happened to be a happy accident that I got into education. I would point out that I feel like all teachers should have some kind of structured experience beforehand, because it really helped me with everything from time management to getting kids to focus when they need to. I feel like that's a skill that is extremely important for a teacher, but not all teachers possess to the degree that is required, I feel.
Yeah. Well, your specific role, actually, this is a question that Brady suggested me. So you don't touch on it so much in the blog post, but I know that your title is math interventionist. So can you talk more about like what you do as a math interventionist, and does that relate to what you mentioned about? I mean, I'm sure you don't yell at the kids, even though that's what you did as a
I
sergeant.
firmly encourage them.
Right. But this idea of having structure, and using that to motivate your students, whether they're, in the Army or they're students at Greyhounds Live Oak, the little owls.
Well, so this is kind of a new job for me this year. All of my teaching experience up until this year has been a regular classroom teacher. But the last couple of years have been, let's say, unusual for all of us, but especially for children. I mean, to be frank, I would say that a large percentage of school children really have not had effective education for the last at least 1 to 2 years. And so there have been very, very large gaps in the kinds of the knowledge that they're supposed to be getting versus what they have been getting and retaining. So because of that, Live Oak has this intervention program where we're looking at the information about where the students are testing at and where they're supposed to be versus where they realistically are. And then I and my colleagues come in and we develop a plan on how to try to condense the information that the students need to have to be successful as much as possible, and give them extra exposure to the material so that hopefully they can catch up with not with their peers, but also where the state expects them to be. So I wouldn't say it's an invasive process, but it's certainly new to me. I mean, there's always been these kind of intervention programs because there's always been some students will always maybe be a bit further behind than their peers. But I would say something that's very relatively new in education is how large a population that has become and how important it is to give them the extra opportunities they need to succeed.
Yeah, no, you make a really good point about that it's been several years since students had sort of a typical school year. We've had multiple, right? Because we're on our third sort of disrupted school year. And, depending on what setting a student is in, even in the best circumstances, if they were experiencing distance learning, it might not have been as effective as on-campus learning. And,
I'm not going to say it might. It definitely was not.
Yeah.
Anybody who tells you different is trying to sell you something.
Yeah. And so then it's a matter of, what you described as, what the Live Oak team is doing is doing assessments to figure out where students are at, and then trying to find the most efficient way to bring the students up to where their peers are so that they can do work that's on grade level. And that's really important work.
I believe so.
Yeah. So you've, as part of your journey to becoming a teacher at Greyhounds Live Oak, you've worked at other schools as well. So I was wondering if you can kind of, and this kind of leads back to my first question about like parents visiting a school and trying to assess, what's going on. So no, I'm not asking you to, don't name names. I'm asking you to trash anybody, but, are there any kind of lessons learned from, working in charter schools that maybe weren't as effective or weren't as well managed?
Absolutely. So one of the strengths and weaknesses of charter schools is that they operate under less of a bureaucratic oversight than traditional independent school districts. So they have more latitude and more freedom about what they're allowed to do versus what they're not. So like I said, it's a good thing because I would say there's a lot of wasted effort in modern education for a whole variety of reasons. So when you don't have as many T's to cross and I's to dot, you can kind of get at the heart of what it means to be an educator easier. But it also means that there is more opportunity for people to do things that they're not supposed to. So this is why again, most of my teaching experience has been in charter schools, and I would say, generally speaking, it is more positive than negative. But I would be lying if I said I had never worked at charter schools that probably should not be open. when all said and done. In fact, one of the schools I worked at was actually closed by the state for very good reasons. But that's, like I said, it's a story for a different time. But another thing I think a lot of parents might not necessarily understand is that charter schools operate with significantly less funding than traditional ISDs. And on the one hand, you might think that's kind of a negative, and it is. Less money equals less resources. But it can lead to unintended fortunate consequences. For example, many charter schools don't have a public transportation role simply because they don't have the budget for it, which seems kind of inconvenient, and is, but it does mean that your student body, like 100% of the students at a charter school, it doesn't have a public education or public transportation system. They have at least one person in their life who cares enough about them to drop them off and pick them up relatively on time every single day. And it's a sad state of affairs, but it's also reality that's not true for everybody. And it makes in my experience, pretty significant difference in the student body as a whole. And as far as the kinds of people you have in that population. So something to think
about. Yeah. I mean, the families who exercise school choice are a sort of self-selected group among all parents, because these are parents and caregivers who are making an effort to choose a school rather than just go with the default option. And so that's been my experience as well, that it's not it's not a random sample of the population. It's a self-selected sample of people who value education and are willing to put a little extra effort into it. And then going back to what you're saying about there are well-run charter schools, and then there are some bad apples. And it's important that during the time that I've been running SA Charter Moms, I've watched several school networks either get shut down or get taken over by other networks, and it's usually for the better. And there are some charter schools that don't do a good enough job and really shouldn't be operating anymore. And I'm grateful that the trend seems to be towards more oversight about charter authorizing, make sure that the new schools that open are likely to be well run, and that that the bad apples, like the ones where there's financial mismanagement, that those schools go out of business, because if they're not serving students, they shouldn't be collecting money from the state. So, but thank goodness for Great Hearts, right? That could be at a school that is focused on the mission, and that has good financial practices and things like that. So you don't have to feel icky about working there.
Definitely.
Yeah. So in your post, you talk about the truth, goodness, and beauty, right? The motto Great Hearts, and how that's implemented at Great Hearts Live Oak. And you mentioned about you encourage families when they visit a campus to look at what is the level of kind of orderliness, and how are students handling themselves. So can you kind of paint a picture of what you're seeing at Great Hearts Live Oak? Like, how is the Great Hearts mission coming to life at Live Oak, and how does that benefit the students?
Right. Well, in the school systems, they generally have not a wide choice on the kind of books that they're teaching their students, as long as it's fitting the curriculum that the school will be tested over at the end of the year. But with Great Hearts, there is a very obvious and a very intentional focus on a lot of the classical texts of the Western tradition. And this is something that I feel is very much lacking in contemporary educational institutions, where everything is focused on, excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. Everything seems to be focused on, what's avant-garde today and the culture wars. In Great Hearts, there is a very clear attempt to take a step back and look at the kinds of texts that have stood the test of time. So there's a big focus on classical philosophy. I mean, people talk about Plato and Aristotle, and we're very much classical philosophers, going on to the Renaissance. And there's there's in almost every grade level, there is an attempt to focus on something that was noteworthy from past generations and past centuries. Because if it stood the test of time, it's probably worth learning. Whereas if somebody comes up with something today, maybe it's the great book of our time, but maybe people will have forgotten it in 5 years. So again, that is a really big part of the Great Hearts philosophy, which is one of the reasons why there's a big focus on avoiding pop culture references in Great Hearts. Not to denigrate popular culture. I mean, there's a time and a place for that. It's just in a school, you should be focusing on learning, and you should not really be focusing on what the individual tastes and styles of the student body or even the faculty are. There's a pretty stringent dress code in Great Hearts, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah, yeah. Growing up, I didn't watch much TV. My parents just didn't let us watch much TV, and it felt like when I would come to school and the kids would be talking about TV shows that I had no clue about, I felt kind of left out. And but at Great Hearts, like my observation has been like the students actually like they will like if there are a bunch of them are like on the bus for a field trip, they will start singing songs that they learned in music class, and they'll start reciting poems that they all learned in literature, and it might be first graders and fifth graders all reciting the first grade poems together because the fifth graders still remember them, and so like the student interaction is centered on the curriculum, which is something you really don't see in a typical school setting. Has that been your observation as well?
Absolutely. Now, I mean, Great Hearts Live Oak is a relatively new Great Hearts school. It started right when COVID started, so it might not necessarily look like some of the Great Hearts schools that have been open for a while. Everyone loves to compare Northern Oaks. We're not there yet, but it's a process. Every year we're getting better at it. And I feel if somebody had been here from the beginning as a parent, I feel like you would believe that the school is traveling in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, one thing you talk about in the post, actually, like the image that I borrowed for the post, it shows like kids playing flag football. That like in the post you described like the amount of like activities the kids get to do, and also like the kind of community engagement that that like families get to do, like the PSO, the Parent Service Organization. Like the parents are very involved on campus. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk more about that, about like what the school community is like at Live Oak.
Well, the school community, again, part of the difficulties of charter schools is that they don't have a set population around the school like traditional independent school districts. So charter school communities are often spread out very far and wide, and that can be challenging when you're trying to create a sense of community. Because of this, there is an attempt by the school to have various outside events or to invite parents into the schools. I remember right before the winter break, we had the choir sessions. The lower grades, they're doing their orchestra, not their orchestra.
Was it the winter concert? And they're all singing, yeah.
Right, and that's just one example. I know our headmaster often has, not often, but on occasion, invites any concerned parent to come and have coffee with her in a kind of group setting, so they can kind of voice any concerns they may have. And we have a fairly significant extracurricular number of extracurricular activities and clubs. This has been a very concerted effort on the part of our school leadership to establish. And again, like I said, this is our second year in operation. So we're still trying to figure out how all this works, especially in the COVID environment. The rules are literally changing from week to week and month to month. So it's been challenging to come up with a cohesive culture in that environment. But again, we're trying.
Yeah. Well, I'm so pleased that even this early in the morning, we're getting some good comments from viewers. So first, I'm going to bring some of these up on screen. So first, Adenari says she's watching from Bill Miller. And now I'm jealous. Now I want to have some breakfast tacos too. Thank you, Adenari.
Major plus of living in San Antonio.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah. Brady mentions that, yes, just as you were saying, Paul, that Great Hearts Live Oak got started during.
Lights went off. I'll be right back.
You've been sitting still. Okay, that's okay. But yeah, we'll talk about it's a challenge. It's not just Great Hearts. I've watched multiple schools, open their doors, during the pandemic, and it can be hard to recruit students and families. It can be hard to establish school culture. And as you said, Paul, the rules change week by week about, what safety procedures are. But yeah, like I can see from social media and like from Great Hearts Live Oak families that I know that there's a lot of effort into building the culture. Okay, so also Brady she said one of her best teachers in high school was a retired Air Force colonel, and earned a lot of respect among the teachers. And
Winnie, you should mention that we actually have a retired Air Force colonel teaching history in Live Oak. He's an interesting man.
but it brings that life experience, and like, no, the school is not going to run like the military,
No,
but it does.
It's very important to mention that.
Right, but it is, the military does have, structure. There's a lot of information that needs to get passed down the chain of command. So and actually, one of my daughter's favorite teachers, my daughter goes to school of science and technology, and we had one of her teachers as did a guest post, Mr. B. He's teaches technology and engineering, and he's an ex-Marine. So I think that's one of the rich things about San Antonio, is that there's so many military veterans in San Antonio, and they bring their skills to whatever their next career is. And the more I see that in education, the more I'm grateful for the military presence in San Antonio.
I think it's a pretty strong asset. I mean, one thing that, man, time management is so important as a teacher, and it is. I mean, when you have as an educator, you will always have 100 things to do, and maybe time enough to do, if you're very efficient, 20 of them. So you're constantly moving from place to place and doing task to task. And if you don't have the mental discipline and fortitude to keep to a schedule, it's very easy to get behind. I know that plagues teachers and me as well. Just it's never ending.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've talked about how COVID impacted, like distance learning was less effective. So you're encountering students who are testing at below grade level in math. But what we haven't really mentioned so far is that how much stress COVID caused on teachers, because of procedures keep changing, and teachers trying to be as effective as they can in spite of obstacles, like for periods of time not be able to be in the same room with their students. And it sounds like time management is an aspect that you've tried to bring to bear to try to make up for some of those challenges.
I mean, you try. Again, it's hopefully at the end of the day, my students learn something. That's the thing I have to try to keep hold of. And because sometimes it's an unfortunate reality, but sometimes there is no perfect solution to things, and you just have to do the best you can.
Yeah. That's good. This is the other day I got to see your colleague Paul Gostowski, and that was kind of the impression I got from him. It's like he's kind of looking at big picture, like how are the students, like how is their mental health, how is their well-being, how do we, and then there's regulations like about additional tutoring hours that students need, and so how does the school manage supporting student progress and student well-being, while also supporting the teachers and your well-being and your sanity, and try to keep, and meanwhile jump through all the hoops of regulation and meeting all the requirements.
I mean, it's a moving target. Everyone, I mean, literally everyone is in unknown territory right now. Remember this conversation I had with Mr. Gostowski last year, when we were just marveling at, in a very negative way, at the things that we were being asked to accomplish with the tools that we were given. There's a point where you realize you literally cannot do what you're asked to do with what you're given. You just have to do the best you can. And yeah, that's something also I think people may overlook, is that in education and going on schools, it's not just about teaching the students reading, writing, and arithmetic. There's a big part of social learning component as well. In schools, this is where children practice the skills they're going to need when they become adults. So it's one of the conversations I have with my students every year is, okay, you go to school every day, just like when you grow up, you're going to go to work every day. That's why it's important to be on time. It's why it's important to be prepared. It's why it's important that you do as you're instructed, as you're asked to, by the different teachers who are trying to help you learn how to be successful. But there's also a big part of them working together and learning how to cooperate and socialize appropriately. And I would have to say that is a really big part of like one of those gaps I was talking about. I'm noticing, man, the students today compared to students 2 years ago, the way they interact has, I believe, fundamentally altered. They've been they've been all in bubbles, almost hermetically sealed bubbles for years. And this is, for a child, that is a non-trivial amount of their lives. and it has resulted in, I would say, cascading negative effects, and that's going to take some time to try to ameliorate. But we do the best we can now.
Yeah. So it's not just a matter of assessing where is the student in math and how do we teach them, the fractions and the multiplication and the decimals, or things, but also, right? It's such a big part of how students work in Greathearts, right? Like they have to explain math problems to each other, right? And then, like by high school, they're in a humane letters seminar and they're, thumbing through their book trying to find quotes to back up their points, and so there's a big social aspect, and it's meant to prepare students to be independent adults who can be leaders. But there's a long way to go because students' lives were so disrupted and they were in such an unnatural environment for several years.
Yep,
Yeah.
that is the unfortunate reality we currently face.
Yeah. Okay, so I know we need to wrap up soon because you share your room with with a colleague, and yes,
knocking on the door right now.
Okay. So Brady makes a comment about the oversight of charter schools. I think one takeaway from this conversation is that charter schools offer flexibility. That's really important. And you mentioned about that if schools that are mismanaged or not meeting their goals, that they can get shut down. Brady makes a comparison with Houston ISD, which has had some campuses failing for years and years and still managed to stay open. So,
yeah, that's one thing I don't think necessarily a lot of parents understand, is that ISDs, because they are so hidebound bureaucratic functions, it's very difficult for the state to exert any real kind of meaningful control. It's one of the reasons why the state of Texas and other states have been promoting charter schools. It's not just because to provide an alternative, it's also to provide an alternative that the state has a larger ability to affect if they see there's a problem. So it kind of keeps the charter schools a bit more on their toes as compared to traditional ISDs.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there's so much we can talk about charter school advocacy, and I'm just so glad that you're tuned in, not just as a teacher, trying to bring your best to your students, but also understanding the charter school world. So anyway, we'll just have to have another conversation. Maybe you, me, Paul Gostowski, Brady, some Greyhounds Live Oak parents, and just have a good conversation. But I know today you have teaching to do, right? You have students to help. So okay, so I guess just to close out, I'm going to put a link on the screen. So liveoak.greatheartsamerica.org is where families who are interested in Great Hearts Live Oak can apply. The lottery's already happened, but
we're in our open enrollment phase. But obviously, the earlier you get in on the list, the more likely you are to be selected in the lottery at the beginning of next year. So,
right,
we can.
Yeah, they're still adding names to the waiting list, and there's been a lot of movement and turnover this year. So, and there are many other Great Hearts campuses, including Great Hearts Invictus on the northwest side, which is brand new. So they have open seats in every grade. So so that's how it is. Oh, and Brady says thank you. So, do you have any final thoughts or anything you want me to pop up on screen?
No, I mean, again, as you point out, there's many things we can talk about. I'm very happy to be working at Great Hearts, and I feel like it is an appropriate place for a parent to place their children if they are concerned about establishing good habits and routines that will serve them throughout their lives.
Yeah, well, good advice. On that note, we'll wrap up, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you, Paul. Thank you for the guest post. Thank you for your time this morning, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Me as well.
Okay, take care.